So first, to my left, we have Dr. Mark Thomas, and he is a professor of neuroscience and scientific director of the Medical Discovery Team on Addiction, a new research-focused program funded by Minnesota's state legislature to fund cross-disciplinary collaboration discovery on new treatment options. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about how you got the state's legislature to fund that. His research examines how addictive drugs alter the brain and how these changes can lead to compulsive drug use. His lab is focusing on ways to disrupt addiction relapse. And he truly is an expert. I was impressed by the range of publications he has on this topic. Next, we have Roni Barak, internationally renowned Lebanese percussionist.
I think...
So close, though.
I set that up. I was just seeing if you're paying attention on the last day of CWA. No.
We would all give a lot to be Roni Barak.
I wish I was Roni. Yeah.
Great. So you guys all do know Chris already. So we have Chris Borland, who we're really lucky to have. He's the All-American and Big Ten Defensive Player of the Year at the University of Wisconsin. He was drafted by the 2014 NFL Draft. I don't know if anyone else has been drafted by NFL in this room, but not sure it's likely. Since then, he has worked in mental health at the Carter Center, and in 2017 led the first study in meditation with NFL players in 2017. He is a meditation teacher and has been featured on a wide range of media outlets, including CBS, Huffington Post, ESPN, and others. Great. Thank you, Chris. And finally, we have Jerry Mikulski, who also needs no introduction, as he is a staple of the Conference on World Affairs. And he has generously offered to join us today to step in. So thank you, Jerry. He helped shape the dot-com revolution as a tech industry trends and analyst. He left the tech business after he realized he didn't like the word consumer, which has taken him towards the topic of trust. He is the published author of jerrysbrain.com, and we're fortunate to be inside Jerry's brain today. Great. So just some housekeeping. As you all know, it's the end of the day, but just to remind you that in this CWA session, we will utilize both the app and the note card system. And I'd recommend that if you are interested in asking a question, you could raise your hand now, and we'll have people start to get that to you. To ask a question in the app, simply select this session in the schedule, tap Q&A, and then insert and send your question. You may also raise your hand to request a note card and pencil from one of our producers. You must write legibly, they say. If you are a student or attending remotely, please note this in your question. Make your questions brief and to the point. Great. So before we begin, I want to set the stage by the fact that we have had over 70,000 people die from a drug overdose in 2017. That's more than at the height of the HIV outbreak, more than at the height of gun violence, and more than all years of the Vietnam War combined. Do you think we're addressing this crisis with the urgency that's needed? So I'll have you answer that question and then also do your introduction. So I'll start with Dr. Thomas on my left.
I think we can do a lot better in addressing this question than we're doing now, and we'll get into that. As Jamie introduced me, I'm a neuroscientist. I'm a biologist of the brain, and I got caught with this idea when I was still a teenager that the brain changes with experience. And to me, that is an absolutely fascinating idea, that there are physical, chemical changes taking place in the brain when we learn new information, for example. We call this neuroplasticity. And I went on after college to study this at UCLA as a PhD student in neuroscience, and my goal there was to study the molecular and cellular mechanisms for this kind of plasticity, this change between neural connections or synapses that occurs in the brain. But it was there I stumbled on the idea that not all neuroplasticity is good, and that by exposure to traumatic experiences, by chronic exposure to drugs of abuse, just to take two examples, that kind of experience can co-opt the brain's neuroplasticity and take it in directions that aren't beneficial. And I think this idea has been around for a while, and we now know that, of plenty of examples where we have identified specific neuroplasticity. I'll tell you about one of those in a minute. But it's still really a field that's in its infancy. And those of us who are doing the kind of work that I'm doing believe that if we understood that kind of deleterious neuroplasticity better, that we could design brain-based treatments that would be truly effective. And I think for across the board for mental disorders, we have a challenge. We do not have very good treatments, and addiction is a prime example of that. So just to do, Jamie already mentioned that there are more than 70,000 opioid deaths in 2017, which is the latest year that we have data for. That's up from 17,000 in 1999. So there's been this incredible spike, and we can talk a little bit about where that might have come from. But I want to spend just a couple minutes here telling you about an example of how opioids change the brain. This is something that we started studying in my lab several years ago. Before that, most of our work actually focused on cocaine and psychostimulants, but we switched over because of the clear need to understand opioids' effect on the brain. So what are these changes, and what are ways that they might lead to craving and compulsive use? This is a really challenging problem to study in neuroscience in people. We ultimately want to understand it in people, but to get the kind of data that we need to resort to using animal models where we could look before and after chronic exposure to opioids. And when we did that in the lab, what we found was that there's a specific change in what we call the reward circuits of the brain. So the reward circuits, very briefly, are present in mice and rats just as they are in people, and they're laid out in a very similar way. They use similar neurochemicals. And so we believe that by studying this circuit in rats and mice, we can understand what's happening in people in a way that would be otherwise difficult to do. So what we found was that in this reward circuit that there was a persistent change that occurred after repeated exposure to opioids. And that persistent change, we were able to use a relatively new technique called optogenetics, which is a fancy neuroscience technique using light to retune synaptic connections in the brain. And I can just talk more about that if people are interested. But we were able to reverse the changes that happened, at least in this one case. And what we found was that in the lab, that disrupted relapse in the mice. That we have an animal model for relapse that a lot of people around the world use. And by retuning this synaptic connection, we were able to disrupt relapse. So that's one thing that gives us hope that we could use that kind of information ultimately to try to benefit people. But that's going to take a lot of work, and it's going to take looking at this from many different perspectives. And that's where we're so thankful that the state of Minnesota stepped up through the legislature to provide money to the University of Minnesota, where I am, to fund the creation of a medical discovery team, as we're calling it, on addiction, that brings together faculty who are in engineering, who are in neuroscience, psychiatry, neurology. So our clinical MDs are, they're working with us on this, so that with the idea that this kind of cross collaboration can ultimately provide some new therapies. So we have a goal of finding biomarkers in the brain, so mapping how addictive substances affect the brain to look for biomarkers, but then also to use that information as targets for potential new therapies. Perhaps with neurostimulation, so not simply substituting one kind of a drug for another, but to as I say, retune synapses in a way that's beneficial and can prevent the kinds of deaths that we're seeing. I'll stop there.
Great, thank you so much.
Thank you, Mark and Jamie, and thanks everyone for being here. It's an honor to be back at CWA. This is my third year, and it's one of my favorite weeks of the year. So I wasn't originally on this panel. I was asked midweek, and I said, hey, sure, let's end a long week with a conversation about opioids. That should be fun. Mark obviously has expertise in addiction research from the neuroscientific point of view. Jerry's a genuine polymath. Log on to jerrysbrain.org.com and just enjoy. We've been on a few panels together, and he's just experienced and learned and knows everything. So enjoy that. Not to set you up for
exactly.
One of my favorite things about this conference isn't just the panels, but kind of the conference within the conference, and getting to know interesting people like Mark and Jerry outside of panels. And Mark and I, Wednesday or Tuesday night, went out for a drink and we're chatting, kind of taking a reprieve from the intellectual rigor of doing 11 panels in 5 days, and talking music. Mark and I share a favorite band, or one of our favorite bands, Wilco. Lead singer Jeff Tweedy has suffered his entire adult life with migraines, and because of that, with opioid addiction. And we couldn't remember it Tuesday or Wednesday, but there's a song that a lot of Wilco fans think Tweedy wrote about his addiction. And it's from a poem that Tweedy wrote, and I'd like to just read an excerpt from it right now. I'll pick it up about midway through. And I've been puking. I move so slow, a steady crushing hand. Holy shit, there's a company in my back. I move so slow, a steady crushing hand. Holy shit, there's a company in my back. He goes into his bedroom with his wife or girlfriend. Hide your soft skin, your sorrow is sunshine, listen to my eyes. Hide your soft skin, your sorrow is sunshine, listen to my eyes. The verse repeats. It's a beautiful song. It's called Company in My Back. It's poignant, and I think Tweedy does a great job of expressing just how heavy a blanket opioid addiction can be. And I'm speaking from personal experience, and so Mark's an expert. Jerry can touch on anything. I played a little football and teach people how to breathe, so I'm not an expert on opioids. But my sophomore year at Wisconsin, I had 3 shoulder surgeries. So January of 2010, had my left shoulder reconstructed. October of the same year, had 2 screws put in that same shoulder. And then December of 2010, while I was out with that injury, had my right shoulder reconstructed. Each time loaded up with painkillers. I don't have an addictive personality. I've never had an issue with tobacco or alcohol or marijuana. It was hard, by spring of 2011, after 3 consecutive shoulder reconstructions, where I was prescribed liberally opioids and painkillers. It was hard to kick the habit. I know you're not supposed to do this, but I was 19 and thankfully came to the realization that I was popping pills to watch a movie or to chill out with my friends, or just to zone out. And I flushed the pills down the toilet, which I know is wrong, but I'm glad I didn't die either. So it was hard, and I don't often talk about it. I think a lot of athletes deal with that to some degree. As sad and dark as this issue can be, to Jamie's question, I think there's some reason to be hopeful. Whether hopefully we get into things about marijuana or meditation or other efficacious therapies that aren't a panacea, but may combat the statistic of 70,000 people dying from opioid overdose. I'd like to strike that hopeful tone in this panel. I'd like to get into things where we can live in the solution. Maybe it's selfish, having hopped on a panel at the end of the week about opioids and not being an expert and having had an issue in the past, but I think we can do that. I think there are things that we can address in terms of being proactive, in terms of finding other avenues to get help. And one issue I'm interested in exploring with respect to those that have suffered with chronic pain or with significant injury is just the notion that it's okay sometimes to hurt. I think sometimes, I can speak at least for athletes and for myself, didn't want to deal with pain and wanted to numb it. And doing some research with monks and with neuroscientists that study meditation, pain doesn't have to equal suffering. And so there's a lot of attachment associated when you feel an intense pain. But there's studies where they actually see, monks who had a thermode attached to their forearm and received an intense sensation of pain. The pain regions in their brain spiked higher than those that didn't have a lot of experience meditating, but they self-reported less suffering. And so I just think that's a really interesting concept and maybe something we can get into. Health and happiness doesn't come from a bottle, and there's other ways to combat it. So thrilled to be here. Thank you all for being such a great audience and such a welcoming community. I'll turn it over to Jerry.
I do love CWA. It's amazing to be able to have a place to have these conversations and to enter these topics. Before addressing the subject, I want to addict you to a small social hack. Some of you have seen me doing this, and some of you know that this means I just agree with what's being said. This means I disagree with what's being said. Feel free to use these, and feel free to propagate them anywhere else you go, because when somebody in the audience does this, it catches, right? And what it does is it connects us to you a little bit better. So we get a little temperature reading. Applause is sort of interruptive, and we don't have like a chat up here, thank God. So we're not busy distracted by the stream of text going up, but the jazz hands thing actually works really well. Thank you. So I'm not a neuroscientist. I have never been addicted to opioids, so I can't speak from personal experience. Probably the closest is playing too much Tetris long ago. When I could see it, I'd close my eyes for sleep and I could see the little things turning in my eyelids. I knew that was too much, and I had to go back.
I'm with you, Jerry.
Yeah.
I've been there.
Oh God, it was so bad. But something Mark was saying suddenly triggered me to go looking around in this piece of software I use called The Brain, and I discovered a TEDx talk that I'd seen long ago by a guy named Johann Hari, H-A-R-I, titled, "Everything We Think We Know About Addiction is Wrong." And he created a place called Rat Park, which was heaven for rats. And basically, long story short, he gave the rats the option of drinking heroin, or a heroin derivative, basically, in the cages, and they would never overdose when they were happy as rats. And all of our animal experiments have poor little animals in little cages who don't have an actual life or relationships, and these animals are very social, and then we expect that the results of these experiments are going to play out like humans. It's a little bit strange, but there's really interesting things. So addiction is just one symptom of the crisis of disconnection, he says. It's not the chemicals, it's your cage. The opposite of addiction is not sobriety, it's human connection. These are all quotes from his talk that I just downloaded, sort of added to my brain, because that's what I do. I take notes about stuff that I care about and put them in there. And again, you can find them by going to jerrysbrain.com and clicking on link launch Jerry's Brain, and you'll see this weird little mind map. And you'll also see some videos explaining what this is and how to do it. So I like that story because my last 25 years start from when I realized I hated the word consumer. And I was a tech industry trends analyst in the middle of the dot-com boom. I estimate that I heard 4,000 pitches from startups in 12 years. So I'm pretty experienced at hearing somebody trying to explain what their startup is about and when they're BSing me and when they're not. But in the middle of that, I realized I hated this word. Much later, I figured out that we've consumerized every aspect of our lives, not just consumer goods like soap, toothpaste, and floor wax, but also our electoral cycle. The reason all our candidates are raising 7 million, 22 million, whatever, is that they're going to pour this money into the media system, which now includes a whip topping called social media, and try to shape our opinions that way. It's not really governance with a little g. We're not sitting together talking about how do we want to handle things like addiction. We're going to hand this over, right? Which is kind of crazy. So do you think you're worthy? Do you think you're enough? Do you think you're beautiful? Those things are mostly controlled by the fashion industry. And our opinions of our own image of ourself are shaped very much by society. Worse than that, a lot of people don't like what they do in the world. So They have jobs. I don't know if you've heard of David Graeber. He has a book out called Bullshit Jobs. And he says a lot of people are doing stuff they know is completely not of value. And then a lot of people with jobs that are a little bit better are busy in the ad business, for example, addicting us to other products against our will, spending money we don't have to spend, for example. So the ad business is certainly a prestige business in the US. I think the language of advertising is the language of a military campaign. And it's part of what are other terms that you might have heard of, the stalker economy and surveillance capitalism. Right? So Facebook is the largest nation on earth. Its business model depends on addicting us to seeing more stuff from our friends and liking, and in the middle having our data sold off so that somebody can sell us more stuff. So all these notions, I think self-regulation and self-care are intensely important here. And I'm sitting next to a meditation expert who's bringing this to places that aren't used to doing things like sitting still and breathing and finding a calm place. So I love that. I think we need to do an awful lot more of that. And in answer to Jamie's question, I think we're absolutely not responding fast enough, that this is a crisis, but it's a crisis that's not going to be solved by finding the drug that stops fentanyl from interacting with our bodies. It's a crisis that needs to be solved by digging deeper into all these layers of crap in our society where our objectives in life are twisted, where our image of ourself is twisted, where our relationships with other people are often severed or harmed. Thank you very much. And all of this stuff is shockingly easy to start dealing with. I mean, finding a job that has meaning and purpose means realizing what that is and then going and looking. And there's jobs out there that have lots of meaning and purpose. Just get into the food business, or the care of other people business or things like that. So I know I'm going long, but I think addiction to opioids is partly a reaction to numbing ourselves, to an epidemic of hopelessness and lack of connection. And like those rats in Rat Park, if we actually had good lives, we would sort of not need to worry so much about the drugs at hand.
Great. Do you want to jump in?
I would like to. Thank you, Jerry. I mean, I'm glad you brought up Rat Park and the other ideas you mentioned, because I think this is to me why addiction is such a fascinating topic to study. I mean, it's an important one from a health perspective, but it's such an interesting one to study because in some ways I think about it as where the mind meets the brain, but it's even greater than that because it's how society's affecting the mind and the brain. And so there are all these thoughts that you brought up about how if society were different, if people had meaning in their lives, that they might not reach for this kind of a substance to numb them. But I think it really goes deeper than that because I really do think there are clear effects on the brain of these drugs, and there are many cases where so now being in this role, the scientific director of this medical discovery team, I have people emailing me each and every day with tragic stories about what happened to them or to members of their family, and it's devastating to read them. But in many cases, there were people who. No, they weren't experiencing necessarily some experience or of trauma or of necessarily needing to numb themselves from something, but they nonetheless found themselves, having a substance use disorder, and so I think there are a lot of interacting factors here, but I don't think we can overlook the idea that. These are pharmacological agents that have effects on the brain, and that those effects can be lasting, and they're different from person to person. But there's something there that I think even if we were able to change society in the way that we should be trying to, that these problems are going to be there, and we need to think about how to address them also from a medical perspective. And it's not an either or. I mean, I think it's both. But experiments like the Rat Park experiment, which is a fascinating one, and is famous in our field, I think sometimes people can take a different conclusion from it that that the drugs are not the problem, that the drugs are not really affecting lasting changes in the brain. And I think that's the wrong message to take from it. So I just want to bring that perspective.
Great. Do you want to go, Chris?
Yeah, I'll add something to that. I think, I view it more as a yes and rather than an either or. I grew up in Dayton, Ohio. Dayton, in many ways, has been at the epicenter of the opioid epidemic. If you want to get from Atlanta to Detroit, you need to go north on I-75. If you want to get from the West Coast to New York or vice versa, you need to go on Interstate 70, two of the most highly trafficked drug highways in the country. Dayton sits at the confluence of I-70 and I-75. It's also, a Rust Belt town that's fallen on hard times. I joke darkly that it's like Detroit, just smaller. And so I think, yes, obviously these drugs are addictive, but I do think in many ways and maybe I'm speaking out of turn, I'm certainly not an expert, but it may start as a symptom of hopelessness. If you don't have meaningful work, if you don't have connection, which I think in this day and age, it's ironic that we're more interconnected than ever, but depression rates have never been higher. Suicidality is rising amongst young people. In places like Dayton, which I was born in 1990, and I think we had over 200,000 people in the city, and now there's about 130,000. We've lost a few of our biggest employers. So I think it's a yes and finding ways, from I don't think when automation puts people out of work that everyone will learn to code and everything will be okay. But finding ways to revitalize communities like Dayton, like Wheeling, West Virginia, other small towns that are experiencing the opioid epidemic in a tragic way, is hugely important. So I do think it's cultural. Obviously, it's physiological too. Mm-hmm. But I know I have personal friends that are desperate and hopeless back home, and turn to this to kind of check out.
Great. Yeah, so I think it's wonderful what we've seen here from both the cultural lens about some of those primary drivers to what could be causing someone to have hopelessness or despair, to also the biological components in our brain that could cause us to experience addiction. One question I have on that front is, we have a question that says, how long does a person that has opioid use disorder, how long does it take for their neural pathways to repair and dopamine levels to return to normal after recovery?
I'll give a
You're
hand.
the neuroscientist, Mark.
Oh, we might get that one.
Yeah,
Thank God we have a neuroscientist on the panel. That's all I
And
can
what
say.
the neuroscientist is going to say is that we don't really have the answer to that
No,
question.
no.
So here's one of the real challenges, and I think I alluded to this earlier, but in studying people and studying people's brains, we don't very often have a before and after, and this is a real challenge. So what we have as a tool in people to look at the brain, our main tool is MRIs. Functional magnetic resonance imaging is the one that's typically used if we're not looking for something structural. And so the way that you would try to address that question perhaps would be with a form of brain imaging. And this sort of thing has been looked at, I know, with amphetamine abusers, to look over time to see how dopamine receptors in the frontal cortex change, and it takes about a year for those to return to near normal, which is an example that the director of the National Institute on Drug Abuse, Nora Volkov, and it's from her own work, she often uses that to say, you can. If you stop, your brain is going to be repaired in some ways, and so that's an example of the kind of hope that you would have if you were able to remain abstinent from drugs once she provides. But we don't, to my knowledge, yet have that kind of information for opioids. But just to riff off that a little bit, I mean, I think something I want to make sure to bring up is that, I mentioned neuroplasticity at the beginning, and the treatments that we have for people with substance use disorders now are mostly psychosocial treatments, things like Narcotics Anonymous and such. Aside from medical assisted therapy using methadone and buprenorphine, which maybe we'll get into. But those kinds of treatments, they work for people. They just don't work for enough people. And so the fact that they work for people, to me, as a neuroscientist, says, no, we can change our own brains in ways that can restore health and function. And we can do that. It doesn't have to be through some kind of medical, intervention with a drug or brain stimulation or something. We have the ability to do that, but I do think that the brain changes that happen with the drugs can be a real barrier to that kind of change. And so what I would advocate, what we need to know more about what those barriers are to try to find ways around them. And that's where the work that we're doing is aimed at.
Great. And we do have a couple of questions about the biological component, so I might just go on that for a moment. And I'm glad you brought the portion about medication-assisted treatment. I just wanted to clarify for folks, if you've heard that MAT, medication-assisted treatment, is a type of treatment that's used for people that do have opioid use disorder. It can be methadone, buprenorphine, Vivitrol is another one. And those are treatments that have been used and seen to be effective for folks in combination with other types of treatment. So I just wanted to clarify. I know that people are coming into this with different levels of background. One student question we have is, how does opioid addiction interact with co-occurring issues like PTSD or personality disorders, especially bipolar disorder?
Yeah, again,
Oh, so thank you.
borderline personality disorder, yeah.
Thank you.
So, challenging question to answer, hot topic in the field. Whenever we combine, and we know that there's this kind of comorbidity, we call it, between different kinds of mental conditions. And because it's difficult for us to try to study any one of them and understand the causes, to understand how they relate to one another is even another level of complexity that we haven't breached. So it's a tough question to answer, but there is pretty clear evidence from just looking at the clinical data that people who've had traumatic experiences in their past their brains are set up in a way to respond differently to pharmacological challenges, like, for example, opioid exposure, and that might predispose them to chronic use and addiction. That doesn't. I wish I had a better answer for that question, but I don't think the data are really in on it.
Okay, great. Another question I'm going to move back from the biological for a moment, just to see about, this one was about what about the Colorado cutting funding for rehabilitation facilities or treatment in general? How does the lack of money and places shutting down, I think maybe Arapahoe House people are talking about, impact the opioid crisis? What is the state's response, and why does funding get cut out?
I can't speak specifically to Colorado. While I was interning at the Carter Center in their mental health program, learned a little bit more about our federal funding for mental health and the history of it. And we used to have these enormous facilities where they'd kind of throw anyone who had issues. JFK's sister, Eunice, had mental illness, lived with mental illness, and in the dark ages of treatment got a lobotomy. And Rose Kennedy, the sister of JFK and Eunice, really encouraged her brother to do something substantive about changing the landscape of mental health treatment in America. And the idea was, rather than these enormous institutions where you would just throw people and basically lock them in rooms, a la One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, the idea was to integrate it into community health and have more specific treatment that people had access to that was appropriate for their challenges, and have it within communities. And they'd begun to do that. And the Reagan administration, not to get into politics, stripped the funding. And so now we don't...
As governor, in fact.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So, what JFK created as a great idea to revolutionize the mental health care system wound up in the 80s with nothing. And today, I shouldn't say nothing, but very little. And today, the institution that provides the most treatment is prison. We see an increasing homelessness epidemic, and I think a lot of people that are relegated to life on the streets have an underlying mental illness. And so I can't speak to Colorado specifically, but I think there's a heavy industry influence. It gets very political, and these things cost money. I mean, it's one thing to talk about culture or research, but to get people the help they need, we need to allocate the appropriate amount of funding to community centers.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and the movement for sort of shutting down these institutions was called deinstitutionalization, way too many syllables. But it kind of ran nationwide, and these people weren't always able to be placed in any kind of neighborhood home or anything like that. They ended up on the street. So a large measure of our present homeless problem is people who normally would have been in some kind of institution. And part of the problem was that there were some studies of those institutions, and people said these are horrible, which in some cases they were, but then they just shut the entire thing down. So we sort of have a cruel safety net in this country, if it can be called much of a safety net. And I think that's part of our problem, is that everybody is on the knife edge. There was a New York Times reporter wrote an article that he and something like 50% of the country or more couldn't come up with $400 in an emergency. He would have had to borrow $400 from his kids, right? And so lots of people are on a real knife edge, and we're moving into a gig economy where the precariat, if you've heard the term, the precariat is the precarious proletariat, sort of, is growing. So how are we supposed to retain hope and see that there's something better coming on? To just add a little layer of complexity, then Richard Nixon starts the war on drugs and criminalizes a lot of things that might have actually been useful had we been allowed to research them properly. Marijuana has all sorts of properties, and hemp has all sorts of properties, but just, try touching it and getting some federal funding. So we're now trying to untangle that, because letting go of the war on drugs, which would decrease incarceration, which has racial effects, et cetera, all these things have knock-on effects like crazy. So we're talking about complex systems of systems and systems of problems. But we've just torn up the social remedies for trying to figure out how this might work. Mm-hmm. We have stigma around this. We have real problems. There's a city in, I think Belgium, I can look it up, where mental illness is welcomed. And this city is famous, and there's a lot of people who normally would be in institutions who are just walking around mainstreamed, and people greet them, and they treat them as citizens of the city. And it really, really helps. Why is this one model city on Earth? Like, what happened? Why is that one model city? Why don't we have more of this around the globe? So I'm a big collector of things that revitalize cities. So if you go in my brain and you look around, look for a node called Revitalizing Cities, and you'll find stories like that.
Wow.
I did say it seemed like there was a response from the audience when we started to talk about criminal justice and how people were incarcerated that may have substance use disorder, and also this idea around potentially harm reduction is what I'm hearing, is that the idea that you're welcoming people if they are using substances, that they're still considered part of the community. I'm not sure if that's exactly what you're saying. Mark, do you have some thoughts?
I have too many thoughts. You all are stimulating many thoughts here, so I had to write some things down. I'm going to try to get through these quickly. So I'm amazed that I didn't know about this, about the Colorado state government, and that's a fact, that taking away funding from some.
Actually, it's complicated. I think
Yeah.
so. Right now, there was Arapahoe House that did close. However, there are increased funding through state funds for treatment, particularly outpatient treatment. We do have still not enough treatment options. There was a bill that was just put forward to look at making it so that Medicaid could cover inpatient residential treatment, which it can't right now. So there is treatment out there sometimes, but it's extremely expensive. For inpatient residential treatment, we do have other options like medication-assisted treatment, biosocial support. I see a comment about looking at how it needs to be comprehensive. But there is not enough. If we look at the cost of what we would need for everyone to have access to treatment right now that wants it, there's not enough.
So it just reminded me of what the federal government has done, which I think is a good step forward, but maybe not everything we need. With putting $600 million into the NIH, which is split between Neurological Disorders Institute and the Drug Abuse Institute. Sounds like a lot of money, but research is expensive. A lot of that money is going towards researching new pain medications, which is very useful, non-addictive pain medications, non-opioids. And another part of it is going into, through the Drug Abuse Institute, into community research on different kind of community initiatives that might provide better treatment in the short term. But relatively little of it, if any, is going into basic research into the brain, which is very disappointing to me. And I think that's something that we provide money for that through NIH, but we can use some more, I think.
I'm interested. Sorry.
Yeah.
When you're done, I have a question I'd love to ask about that.
You brought up and so I was going to say about state governments. So I think some of that has fallen to the state governments to provide money for this for new treatment facilities and things like that. So good to hear that it's not all bad news on the Colorado front.
It's not all bad news. I think I see some treatment providers in the audience, even maybe one or two. But there still is a lot more to be done. I have one question we have here. Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry, but you mentioned the war on drugs, and I think we do need to talk about. I don't know if this is the right time or not.
What does the audience
Always
think?
a good time to talk about war.
Okay, great.
So my perspective on this, the war on drugs is really a war to reduce the supply. And that's a certain perspective, and I think it's an important perspective, and it rolls into this idea of why do we have an opioid epidemic? In part, I do believe it's because of the overprescription of prescription opioids, right? I think probably pretty much everyone's going to agree with that. That when you go in and you have shoulder surgery or knee pain or whatever, that you get a prescription for 60 pills and that you may only need one or two of, if any, right? So there and that's beginning to change, and it needs to continue to change. And so curbing the supply is important, but understanding the demand is really important, because that supply is very difficult to curb. And I think that's one reason why the war on drugs has really not succeeded. We just, chemists are very inventive, and they can come up with all sorts of formulations that tap into our reward circuits in a way that it provides new addictive drugs. So we tamp down on the ones we've got, and new ones appear. There's a problem with demand, and I think your thought in that if we were able to change society in ways that could reduce that demand, that's going to make a big difference. Also, if we understand the brain circuits, I think that's going to make a big difference, and we need to focus on that more as a society than trying to curb the supply, because that is not proven to be effective. Sorry to go on a rant, but I wanted to make sure I got that one.
That was great. And going off that, actually, and it might be what you're going to talk about too, is there were 2 student questions just about what are your thoughts about treating addiction with psilocybin? What role does kratom play in recovery? And then another one that says, I work with people who do have substance use disorder, and I don't think that people know enough about the withdrawal symptoms and how intense they are. Would any of those?
So
That's a lot.
Yeah.
I like getting
all
what your
those.
thoughts are out there. I want the audience communication. But I think it is, because as much as this is cultural and it is biological, there are people right now that have substance use disorder and are dealing with it and trying to find solutions. So, it is a cultural issue, but at the same time, if someone dies tomorrow, how do we help those people too right then?
I'll take a quick swing at the question, although I have no idea about the biology of the biochemistry of the brain. But my question to Mark was going to be about alternate approaches such as hypnosis and acupuncture, which in many, you go to China, acupuncture works, and maybe it's a placebo effect, maybe it's a cultural thing, but it really works. Seems to work also for a lot of people in the U.S. who approach it and take it, right? One of my favorite psychologists ever, Milton Erickson, had polio twice in his life, ended up in a wheelchair with chronic pain, managed his pain through hypnosis, and used hypnosis to open up a conversation with our unconscious and offer it a wider variety, a wider repertory of behaviors to eliminate phobias and fix things. He was brilliant. Michael Pollan just wrote a book, Changing Your Mind, about microdosing and other sorts of approaches. I think that's tremendous things are possible there. And again, psilocybin is a mushroom. And I'm reading a book right now called The Mushroom That Changed the World about, I'm forgetting the name of the mushroom. I'm gonna have to look it up. But it's really interesting, all the things that you can do with simple products like mushrooms.
I've got a few thoughts on that. First of all, that I agree, and that's great. With the war on drugs, I think we all know is perpetrated against people of color and liberals, basically. There's a different tone with the opioid epidemic. We're punishing people in inner city communities for smoking a little bit of weed, and then there's more concern when it's people with opioids in Appalachia, and I think that's very much a racial component. And I think there's an intersection too with industry. We haven't mentioned Purdue Pharma and others, but there's a lot of money to be made on people being sick, not healthy. I want to go back to what I started with at the beginning in my hope of striking a hopeful tone. As this heinous and terrible as the war on drugs has been, I think there's a resurgence into research into psychedelics that's really promising. MAPS is an organization that does research with psychedelics, and the FDA just approved a trial for MDMA treatment for PTSD beginning in 2021 or 2022. Hugely promising. I don't know if anybody in the audience has experience with MDMA. I knew this guy that played football and had a roommate that went to Burning Man, and he tried it, and he told me it worked. So yeah, exactly. But I think, Mark mentioned, brilliant chemists that have been working on this for a long time. One is a guy by the name of Sasha Shulgin, who's since passed, but went to Harvard as a teenager, had FDA approval to create these compounds, all in the hopes of combating psychological disorders. Synthesized literally hundreds of compounds, including MDMA, and was treating people in the Bay Area for a long time. MDMA is can be referred to as 6 months of psychotherapy in a pill. Not necessarily neurotoxic, as I understand it, so long as you don't do it habitually. So I think that's hugely promising, and it's great to see a resurgence with MAPS. Nothing's more mainstream than the FDA approving a trial, in conjunction with the Department of Defense. So what a promising thing. I've got two brothers that are veterans. One has post-traumatic stress. I'd love for him to be a part of that. And I think as dark as this issue can be, alternative approaches, thinking outside the box, exploring things like psychedelic has the potential to curb the fact that 70,000 people die from overdose in 2017.
So just to address this idea of alternative therapies, I think neuroscience is going to be able to provide a useful window into these alternative therapies to turn them from, at least some of them, from alternative into useful mainstream therapies. So I think neuroscience is a way to get from alternative to mainstream. That's my sort of optimistic perspective, maybe quite biased. But there are many treatments that work for 25% of the people or 30% of the people, but not the other 70, 75%. And why is that? We'd like to know more about individual to individual variability and the reactivity to different kinds of treatments. I mean, of course, that goes across medicine. But in terms of treatments for mental conditions, those go through the brain. And so by mapping out the effects of, for example, acupuncture, sorry. Clearly I need some acupuncture to improve my memory. Then people have been starting to work on that sort of thing, and you can do that in animal models. Actually, one of my colleagues at the University of Minnesota has done some of that work for pain. That goes for psychedelics as well. To me, how I think about the psychedelic question, which I think is a fascinating one, and we clearly do need more research on it, is that might be a way to set the stage for beneficial neuroplasticity. So it's not necessarily a cure-all, but I think that it can be a way in changing the neural setting of the brain to facilitate beneficial plasticity. Does that make sense? I mean, I don't know. I'm seeing a few hands go up, and none go down. So I don't know.
That's good.
You're all too polite, maybe. When I often think about for people who the psychosocial treatments work in addiction, it's often because they put themselves in a completely new environment. So that's kind of the idea about you go to a treatment facility somewhere, out in the mountains, in the woods somewhere, and you're in a different environment than where you were. You've got an opportunity there for a different kind of neuroplasticity than you would if you were back at home. And it's possible that psychedelics could provide that kind of a new setting that could facilitate the neuroplasticity. Something we clearly need to research on the biological level, but it's a super interesting topic to me.
Great. Yeah, and there was another question about ibogaine too, which another one that is out there that people are looking at. Chris, I wanted to bring this in a little different direction, and I wanted to see your thoughts, just having struggled yourself, with having been prescribed an opioid and then started using them and having to start to feel the experience of, feeling the dependence on it. I was wondering if you would be willing to share just a little bit more about what your personal experience was, and maybe of those that you saw around you.
Oh, yeah. It's a common problem among football players. I think we see sometimes a guy fail a drug test for marijuana and say, "Oh, what a bonehead! How could he have done that? He threw away his career." In reality, a lot of most guys in the NFL, I'd estimate a third. It's based off no science, just my personal experience. I'd estimate about a third of guys smoke weed just because they're in a lot of physical pain. They're asked to do something that's entirely unnatural. To hit people every day from August through January for years on end since you're a little kid. It's a hard thing to do. And, speaking in the NFL, the policy to me really is an evaluation about their consumer base. So the NBA's policy isn't the same. It's more lax. And I think that has to do with the fact that the NBA fan base is more cosmopolitan, generally speaking more progressive. A lot of the NFL fan base comes from flyover states, comes from places like where Jeff Sessions came from, and people, and marijuana is still taboo. So I know that it's not, wouldn't solve the issue. I know there's there's problems in terms of whether or not marijuana is addictive, and there's certainly an interplay between THC and traumatic brain injury in terms of developing psychosis, particularly for young people. But having experienced it myself, and knowing some data on the players that leave and are addicted, I am in full support of changing the NFL's policy on marijuana. There's some players that are spearheading that effort in terms of getting retirees help. Jake Plummer is one. He was a longtime Broncos quarterback. He lives here in Boulder. Jake shares with me from time to time some really promising data on overdoses being decreased in the states that have legalized marijuana since 2013. So I don't think it's perfect, but that 70,000 figure is just staring me in the face, and I think if we can find something else that would combat that, it would help so many people.
Thank you. Great. Yeah. And I'm seeing a lot of questions here that I think kind of relate to that, but also just this idea around stigma around people that are using substances or people with opioid use disorder. There was a question someone asked is, once someone is the term that the person uses, opioid addict, would they always be that? Another one around naloxone and its availability. Is there anything that you can talk about, kind of the stigma around people that use opioids and what we can do as a society to combat it, whether it's from the approach of understanding the brain chemistry and understanding the dopamine and maybe, what is happening in someone's brain to cause them to be addicted, or it's from some other perspective?
Yeah, I'd like to take that question. So I think that is one of the side benefits, and an important side benefit of studying the effects of addictive drugs on the brain, is that there's something there that you can you can point to and say that there's something different about me, or there's something different about my loved one, and they're not a derelict. This is a brain change, and that it might sound trivial, but I think if everyone sort of was able to see it that way, that would make a big difference in society and how we look at this. It's clearly a different kind of, call it a disorder, than cancer or something like this. And I didn't mention this before, but this is one of the fundamental things we always talk about in the neurosciences of addiction, that this is really attacking the decision-making parts of our brains. That's a pretty fundamental concept, So, there's this common idea. Why can't they just stop doing that? They know that they don't want to do it. They know they don't want to do it. They can see that it's harming them. Why is this? And it's hard for the rest of us who aren't dealing with that to understand that. And it's important to remember that these drugs are rewiring the decision-making parts of the brain. That puts up a barrier that the rest of us don't have and can't even conceive of, I think, most of the time. Why are these people doing things to harm themselves? Mm-hmm. And so that's where I wanted to take that question into that area. The decision-making parts of the brain are the ones that are getting affected there. There was another part to the question, though, maybe.
It was just the idea around, someone asked about naloxone, too. That's a little bit different, but I guess the idea is around, a couple people asked about dopamine and what is actually happening in the brain. Would you say that then, someone, when they're not having this dopamine, it's hard for them to make a decision, right? So it's hard for them to actually, in terms of to stop using. But let me move to Jerry. Yep. Jerry, did you have a thought about this?
Just to where we were a moment ago, and naloxone is an intervention drug that they give people who are suffering from an overdose. Yes. So I saw you going, no what?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Good.
Also called Narcan.
Narcan is the brand name.
Yeah.
So just in hearing a show or reading an article, the best description I've heard of this was that when you take one of these opioids the first time, it's like being hugged by Jesus. and that every or kissed by Jesus, was that it? Kissed by Jesus, thank you. I was wondering, I was sitting here, was it hugged, was it kissed? And that every subsequent taking of the drug is not quite as good as the first, so you're always chasing that first high and never quite get back there. By all of which, by way of suggesting that maybe what's happened is that in their hierarchy of wants in the world, that thing just sat on top of everything. Yeah. And they may want to let go of it, they may want whatever else, but that just sat on top of everything.
And just to get into dopamine here, not to get too heavy on the neurochemistry, but since dopamine came up a couple times, it sounded like, our initial thought, so dopamine is a neurotransmitter in the brain, an important neurotransmitter in the reward circuits that I talked about that help to guide our behavior towards natural survival kind of stimuli. Nutritious food, opportunity for sex, building social networks, and things like that. All drugs of abuse tap into this circuit and increase dopamine release. And we wondered for a long time, what is that signal carrying, that dopamine release? And the initial idea was that it's pleasure itself. That's the manifestation of pleasure. When dopamine is released, that's when the euphoria kicks in. But it turns out it's a lot more complicated than that. And so more recent experiments have shown that really the signal that it carries is more like, pay attention to what's going on around you right now, remember it, and if all possible, get back to this situation again. And so the normal rewarding experiences give us that dopamine burst, but drugs of abuse give us a incredibly much larger dopamine burst. And so the signal that we think it's carrying then is, get back to this situation if at all possible. Your survival depends on it. And obviously that can't happen every time anyone's exposed to a drug of abuse, or we'd all be addicted now to anything we'd have been exposed to. So it's something that needs chronic exposure in order to really sink in terms of learning in the brain. But that, I think knowing that, I hope helps to explain a little bit more about what happens in some people. It's not necessarily that they're searching for the pleasure that they found in that experience. It's that the neurochemicals, dopamine in particular, in the brain say, this is important for your survival. And it may not be something you're consciously aware of. It's just that you have that signal that says, get back there and do that again, because that somehow is important for survival when it's clearly not.
Great, thank you. And that's great. I know I made it a little bit more of a Q&A than a panel, so I appreciate the panel's willingness to go there and to kind of drill into some of these questions. There were a couple thoughts about, we've talked a lot about the biological and the cultural. Are there other aspects of addiction that we're missing? The things about poverty or race or just someone's zip code, intergenerational trauma or income? Are there things that are making it harder for people to combat this, or is there some component to it? Is it all just biological, or is there some other component to it as well?
I'm happy to jump in on that. So I had made a couple notes here as we're getting close to the end of our conversation. Should you give us the floor for what things would we like to say? And the first one was, well, we haven't talked enough about the pharmaceutical industry's role. You mentioned Purdue briefly, and we could, but that could eat several different sessions. So let's not go there right now. And my second note was about trauma. And there's layers and layers and layers of trauma. I'm of the belief that trauma is much more widespread than we think it is, and that it's more treatable than we think it is. And by this, I don't mean drugs, I mean therapy. So if you're interested, there's a whole bunch of people who are experts at healing from trauma, like Bessel van der Kolk, Nadine Burke-Harris, Stephanie Mines, Gabor Mate, Richard Strozzi-Heckler, Peter Levine. Look up any of those names, and they are gold mines, or look in my brain under healing from trauma. And you'll find these people and a lot of their books and a lot of the research and some TED Talks and whatever else. That's the one. Thanks.
I'm going to stop reading or watching movies and just log on to Jerry's brain. Hopefully I can download it soon.
This is actually my secret plan to take over the human race, by the way. In full operation as we speak. Exactly. Then I'll make you all buy something. So I think we underrepresent how much trauma there is in society. And I didn't even talk about intergenerational trauma, the trauma of the sins that America was founded on that are still unremedied. Years ago, I went to the Anthropological Museum in Vancouver, Canada. Canada, a much nicer country than ours, I think. And they had apology letters in the back. A little bit? Okay. Well, marginal's good. And they had, in the back, they had an exhibit about the residential schools, because Canada did the same thing to their first people we did, that Australia did, by the by. And they had apology letters up, one from the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, one from the Roman Archdiocese, one from the Government of Canada, and I'm forgetting what the other one or two were about. And these were, in my opinion, sincere apologies. We fucked up, this is what we did, this is the harm to you, you are valuable, this is what we're doing to fix it, blah, blah, blah. I was crying reading these. That's a beginning of an approach toward healing some of the intergenerational trauma that's behind all this. Never mind sexism, racism, and all the other things that are, Kavanaugh hearings. Have we fixed sexism? No? That's trauma. Like psychological visits shot up after the Trump election, after Kavanaugh, shot up. So no wonder people are trying to medicate and numb.
Great. We have about 5 minutes left, so I do want to give the opportunity for our panelists just to close on one comment or one ending. I know that the topic of hope has come up a lot. We have hope there's less snow outside. And I know there's hope that there's a lot of people are working really hard on this issue here in this audience, and just everyday people that are using substances or on a variety of different levels working on this. So I think that's definitely a portion of hope. And I'd like to leave it for our audience, for our panelists, to also leave us with one final comment, and if possible, to leave it with a message of hope.
I won't talk directly about those that live with addiction, but I actually think something that could be really useful, something that I've worked in a little bit, is to help caregivers. So whether it's brain injury or mental health or addiction, it doesn't just happen to one person. It happens to everyone that they come in contact with. So I'll shamelessly continue to proselytize about meditation. I think it's a wonderful way to combat chronic distress that caregivers often endure. Mark mentioned, alluded to habituation and training your attention. There was a really interesting, simple study done in 2012 at Harvard where they texted people, "What are you doing right now? What are you thinking about? Are you happy?" And so first of all, people were thinking about something else other than what they were doing 47% of the time. And the strongest corollary between happiness was whether or not your mind and your attention were in unison with what you were actively doing. So if you're pulling weeds and really, watching the dirt, pulling the weed, covering it up, you'd be happier than if you were at a ball game thinking about your taxes. So it's a really simple thing. I don't mean to trivialize, what people endure, but it might be a tool, a really practical thing you could do every day if you have someone that you are a caregiver for, or if you're a professional that works in that world and take on the stress of dealing with clients or people you advocate for that are going through hell. So meditate. Thank you.
So one hopeful note that I'd like to end on is that, although we're talking about an opioid crisis, and this is in some ways cold comfort to people who have a personal connection to that crisis, but it's drawing attention to something which is really a larger problem, and both Jerry and Chris got into that. We have a problem with other addictive substances, alcohol, nicotine, psychostimulants. In some ways, by addressing this opioid crisis in what I believe is the right way, by understanding the demand side, we can affect things that are much, much larger than just to quash this current epidemic. And so I think it's drawing attention to something which is a larger problem, and it's a personal problem, but it's also a societal and economic problem to deal with this health crisis that we have that goes really beyond opioids. And so I think it's helping to draw attention and resources to something that, if we really address it fully, is going to fundamentally change the world, I believe.
And I'll just say that I tend to bring a little bit of dark realism to CWA panels, so I think my slightly hopeful notion that trauma is more treatable than we think it is my closing note. Thank you for being here.
Yes, thank you to you all.
Yeah. Thank you to our wonderful panelists, and thank you to our wonderful audience, because you guys have been great, very engaged. Thank you so much. And if you want to learn more about how you can address this in Colorado, we have someone from the Boulder Substance Use Advisory Group here, and I'm here from the Colorado Consortium for Prescription Drug Abuse Prevention, and we're happy to share information and resources. Thank you so much.
Oh, that's handy. That is so good.